Mile 247 on Route 66. Every time he passed it, a tall, silent shadow appeared in his mirror, keeping pace for exactly 17 miles. And when it vanished, something followed him home. If real highway mysteries keep you up at night, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. This story goes places headlights don't reach. Jake Morrison had driven over 2 million miles in his 23 years as a long-haul trucker, but nothing prepared him for what waited at mile marker 247 on the old Route 66 stretch through Arizona. Every single time he passed that exact spot, a shadow appeared in his rearview mirror, a figure that shouldn't exist, standing in the middle of an empty road behind his 18-wheeler. The shadow followed him for exactly 17 miles before vanishing without a trace. What Jake discovered when he finally stopped running would reveal a connection between the living and the dead that defied every law of nature, and a truth that had been waiting 40 years for someone to find it. Jake Morrison wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. He was a practical man, 51 years old, with calloused hands and a weathered face that told the story of countless nights spent behind the wheel of his Kenworth W900. He had hauled everything from electronics to produce across every state in the continental United States, and he prided himself on knowing the roads better than he knew his own living room back in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The highways were his home, the diesel fuel was his coffee, and the endless white lines were his meditation. But in late September of 2025, something changed on a route he had driven at least 50 times before, and it would shatter everything he thought he understood about the world. The first time Jake saw the shadow, he convinced himself it was exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. It happened on a Tuesday night around 11:45, as he was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Albuquerque to Flagstaff. The moon was full that night, casting an eerie silver glow across the desert landscape that stretched endlessly on both sides of the old highway. Route 66, through this particular stretch of Arizona, had been mostly abandoned after the interstate system took over, but some truckers still used it as a shortcut, enjoying the lack of traffic and the nostalgic feeling of driving America's most iconic road. Jake had always loved this route, the way the saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels in the darkness, the way the stars seemed close enough to touch in the clear desert sky. He had just passed mile marker 247 when he glanced in his rearview mirror to check his trailer. That's when he saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, perhaps 200 feet behind him, was a dark figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape seemed to waver and distort like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. Jake's first instinct was to hit the brakes, thinking maybe someone's vehicle had broken down and they were trying to flag him down for help. But something about the figure made him hesitate. It wasn't moving like a person would move. It just stood there, perfectly still, and as Jake watched in his mirror, it began to follow his truck, gliding along the pavement without any visible means of locomotion. Jake's heart rate increased, but he tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the moonlight, or perhaps some kind of optical illusion caused by the desert heat still radiating from the ground even at night. He had been driving for 14 hours straight, and fatigue could certainly make the mind see things that weren't there. He rubbed his eyes, took a long sip from his thermos of coffee, and looked again. The shadow was still there, keeping pace with his truck exactly, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. It maintained a constant distance of about 200 feet, moving at precisely the same speed as his Kenworth. For 17 miles, Jake watched that shadow follow him in his mirrors. He tried speeding up, pushing his truck to 75 miles per hour on the empty highway. The shadow kept pace. He slowed down to 45, and still, the shadow maintained its exact distance. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the cool night air flowing through his cab. He considered pulling over, confronting whatever this thing was, but something primal in his gut told him that would be a terrible mistake. So he kept driving, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, watching that impossible figure glide along behind him. Then, at mile marker 264, exactly 17 miles from where it had first appeared, the shadow simply vanished. One moment it was there, a dark presence that had filled Jake with inexplicable dread, and the next moment the road behind him was completely empty. Jake pulled over at the next rest stop, his heart pounding in his chest. He climbed out of his cab on shaking legs and walked around his entire rig, checking every inch of it, looking for any logical explanation for what he had just witnessed. There was nothing. No damage, no strange marks, nothing out of the ordinary. Just his truck, the empty parking lot, and the sound of desert wind whistling through the darkness. Jake tried to sleep that night in his cab, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw that shadow in his mind, its impossible height and the way it moved without walking. He told himself it was a one-time thing, a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. He promised himself he would take a few days off when he got back to Tulsa, maybe see a doctor about getting his eyes checked. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, Jake knew he had seen something real, something that existed in a space between the living world and something else entirely. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Long Road Stories, smash that like button, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to hear what happens next. Jake tried to avoid that stretch of Route 66 for the next 3 weeks. He rerouted his trips, took longer paths, made excuses to his dispatcher about why he couldn't take certain loads. But the trucking business doesn't allow for too many detours, and eventually his company assigned him a rush delivery that absolutely required him to take the old highway through Arizona. It was a Thursday night in mid-October when Jake found himself approaching mile marker 247 again, and this time he was prepared. He had his phone mounted and recording, a digital camera on his dashboard, and he had made sure to get a full night's sleep before the trip. If something appeared again, he would have proof. The desert night was darker this time, with no moon to illuminate the landscape. Jake's headlights cut through the blackness, revealing nothing but endless asphalt and the occasional reflective mile marker post. He'd been listening to a talk radio station to keep himself company, but as he approached the fateful mile marker, static began to interfere with the signal. The voices on the radio distorted, stretched out into long, incomprehensible sounds that made Jake's skin crawl. He reached to change the station, and that's when he saw it again in his rearview mirror. The shadow was back, but this time it was different. It was closer, maybe only 150 feet behind his trailer, and it seemed more defined, more solid. Jake could make out what appeared to be arms hanging at its sides, impossibly long arms that reached down past where knees should be. The figure was at least 9 or 10 feet tall, and its head, if that's what it was, seemed to tilt to one side as if studying Jake's truck with curiosity. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed his phone, trying to angle it to capture the image in his mirror, but when he looked at the phone's screen, there was nothing there. The camera showed only an empty road behind him, but when he looked directly at the mirror, the shadow was clearly visible. This time, Jake decided to do something different. Instead of just driving through and waiting for it to disappear, he grabbed his CB radio and switched to channel 19, the channel most truckers monitored. His voice was shaking as he pressed the transmit button. "Breaker 19, this is Shadowhawk, looking for any drivers on Route 66 near mile marker 250. Anyone out there seeing anything unusual tonight? Over." The radio crackled with static for a moment, then silence. Jake was about to try again when a voice came through, old and gravelly, with an accent that suggested decades spent in the Southwest. "Shadowhawk, this is Desert Fox. I copy you at mile marker 250. What kind of unusual are we talking about, driver?" The voice sounded cautious, almost knowing. Jake hesitated, wondering how crazy he would sound, but the shadow in his mirror was undeniable, and he needed to know if anyone else had experienced this. "Desert Fox, I've got something following my trailer. It's been with me for about 3 miles now, staying at a fixed distance. I know how this sounds, but I'm stone cold sober and wide awake. Have you ever heard of anything like this on this stretch?" There was a long pause, filled only with the hiss of static and the rumble of Jake's diesel engine. When the voice came back, it was quieter, more serious. "Shadowhawk, you're seeing the follower. Get off this highway as soon as you can. Take the next exit. Don't stop until you're on the interstate. We need to talk, but not on the open channel. There's a truck stop called Cactus Jack's about 40 miles north on I-40. Meet me there in an hour. I'll be in a blue Peterbilt 379 Desert Fox out." The radio went silent. Jake looked in his mirror. The shadow was still there, and now it seemed to be moving slightly, its arms swaying as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. Jake pressed harder on the accelerator, watching his speedometer climb to 80 miles per hour. The shadow kept perfect pace. For the next 14 miles, Jake drove faster than he had ever driven on this stretch of highway, his entire body tense with fear and adrenaline. His eyes constantly flicked between the road ahead and the mirror behind, watching the shadow maintain its impossible pursuit. Then, just as before, at mile marker 264, the shadow vanished. But this time, just before it disappeared, Jake swore he saw it raise one of those impossibly long arms, pointing directly at his truck, or perhaps at him specifically. The gesture was deliberate, intentional, and it filled Jake with a terror that went bone deep. Jake took the next exit ramp so fast his trailer swayed dangerously. He didn't slow down until he was safely on Interstate 40, surrounded by other vehicles, their headlights and taillights forming a river of normalcy that pushed back against the supernatural dread that had gripped him. His hands were still shaking 45 minutes later when he pulled into the parking lot of Cactus Jack's truck stop. He had no idea what he was about to learn, but something told him that the shadow following him was just the beginning of a much deeper and darker mystery that had been waiting decades to be uncovered. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to the Long Road Stories, hit that like button, and comment below with your location. Part 3 will reveal secrets that some people have tried to bury for 40 years. Cactus Jack's truck stop was one of those old-school places that had been serving truckers since the 1970s, with flickering neon signs advertising diesel fuel, hot coffee, and 24-hour showers. Jake parked his Kenworth in the far corner of the lot and sat in his cab for a moment, trying to collect himself. His heart was still racing, and his mind kept replaying the image of that shadow pointing at him just before it vanished. He had driven through blizzards, sandstorms, and mechanical failures that should have killed him, but nothing had ever made him feel the kind of existential dread that came from being followed by something that defied explanation. A few minutes later, a blue Peterbilt 379 pulled up next to Jake's truck. It was an older model, probably from the early 2000s, but it was immaculately maintained. The chrome gleamed even under the sodium vapor lights of the parking lot, and the paint job looked fresh. The driver who climbed down from the cab was in his 70s, lean and weathered like a piece of old leather, with white hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that only comes from spending a lifetime on America's highways. He walked over to Jake's truck and knocked on the door. "You Shadowhawk?" he asked, his voice the same gravelly tone from the CB radio. Jake nodded and climbed down to meet him. "Jake Morrison. Thanks for responding. I thought I was losing my mind out there." The older driver extended his hand. "Raymond Cortez. But everyone calls me Ray. Been driving these roads for 52 years, and I can tell you right now, you're not losing your mind. What you saw is real, and it's been haunting that stretch of Route 66 since 1986. Come on, let's get some coffee. This is going to take a while to explain." They walked into the truck stop's diner, a time capsule of red vinyl booths and a long counter with spinning stools. At this hour, just past 1 in the morning, the place was nearly empty, except for a tired-looking waitress and another trucker hunched over a plate of eggs in the corner. Ray led Jake to the booth furthest from the door, where they could talk without being overheard. After the waitress brought them 2 cups of black coffee, Ray leaned back and studied Jake with those knowing eyes. "First thing you need to understand is that what follows trucks on that stretch isn't random. It chooses specific drivers, ones who have a connection to what happened back in '86. Tell me something, Jake. You ever driven for a company called Western Star Logistics? Jake's blood ran cold. Western Star Logistics had been one of the first companies he had driven for when he started trucking back in 2002. He had only worked for them for about 8 months before they went out of business. But he remembered the owner, an older man named Frank Morrison. Yeah, I worked for them briefly over 20 years ago. Why? Ray took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. Western Star Logistics was owned by Frank Morrison. Any relation? Jake felt his mouth go dry. Frank Morrison was my uncle. He died in 2003, heart attack. But what does that have to do with the shadow? Ray's expression darkened. Everything. Your Uncle Frank was driving for himself back in October of 1986. He was hauling a load of auto parts from Phoenix to Flagstaff, taking Route 66 because it was faster and he was running behind schedule. At approximately mile marker 247, he came across another trucker who had broken down on the side of the road. The driver's name was David Holloway, 34 years old, father of 2, from Amarillo, Texas. Ray paused, his fingers tapping nervously against his coffee cup. Frank stopped to help, like any good trucker would. David told him his rig had developed some kind of mechanical problem and he couldn't get it started. Frank offered to radio for help, but David seemed anxious, kept looking around like he was expecting something. Frank noticed that David's trailer doors were slightly open, which was strange because David was supposedly hauling electronics that needed to be secured. When Frank asked about it, David got defensive, told him to mind his own business and just call for a tow truck. Ray's voice dropped lower, but Frank was curious. While David was under the hood pretending to check his engine, Frank looked in the back of the trailer. What he saw made him wish he had just kept driving. Jake leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. What was in there? Ray met his eyes, and Jake saw something in them that looked like old guilt mixed with fear. Stolen goods, but not just any stolen goods. David Holloway had been intercepting shipments, stealing entire loads worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and reselling them through a black market network. But that wasn't the worst part. Frank found something else in that trailer, evidence of something much darker, something that suggested David wasn't working alone and that his operation involved people who were willing to do terrible things to protect their business. Ray took another sip of coffee, his hand shaking slightly. Frank panicked. He ran back to his truck to radio the police, but David realized what was happening. There was a confrontation, and that's where the story gets complicated because there are 2 versions of what happened next. According to the official police report, Ray explained, David Holloway vanished that night without a trace. His truck was found abandoned at mile marker 247, with the engine still warm and the trailer doors wide open. Most of the stolen goods were gone, taken by whoever David was working with. Frank claimed he had knocked on David's truck to tell him he had radioed for help, but when he looked inside, David was gone. Frank said he waited for 20 minutes, but David never came back, so he continued on his way and reported it to the authorities at the next town. The police investigated, but David Holloway was never found. No body, no evidence of foul play, just a missing trucker and a bunch of unanswered questions. But here's what really happened, Ray said, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank told me the truth years later, after the guilt had been eating at him for so long that he couldn't keep it inside anymore. When Frank confronted David about what he found in the trailer, David pulled a knife. There was a struggle. Frank was defending himself, but David lost his balance and fell, hitting his head on the trailer's loading ramp. The impact killed him instantly. Frank panicked. He was scared that no one would believe it was self-defense, scared that David's partners would come after him, so he did something he regretted for the rest of his life. Ray looked down at his coffee, unable to meet Jake's eyes. Frank dragged David's body into the desert, about half a mile off the highway. He covered it with rocks and brush, wiped down any evidence, and drove away. He took David's wallet and keys and threw them in a river 200 miles away. Then he called the police and told them the story about finding an abandoned truck. Frank thought he would be able to move on, thought he could live with what he had done. But the desert doesn't forget, Jake. And neither does Route 66. Ray finally looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. 3 weeks after David disappeared, Frank drove that same stretch of highway and saw something in his rearview mirror, a shadow, impossibly tall, following his truck. It followed him for exactly 17 miles, from marker 247 to 264. The same 17 miles that now follow you. Jake felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath him. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. The shadow, the specific mile markers, the way it seemed to be watching him personally. But why me? I didn't do anything. I wasn't even driving back then. Ray nodded slowly. That's what I'm trying to figure out. The shadow, what we call the follower, it appeared to Frank hundreds of times over the years. It never hurt him, but it never let him forget what he had done. When Frank died in 2003, most of us thought the hauntings would stop, but then other drivers started reporting sightings. At first, we thought maybe it was just urban legend, truckers scaring each other with ghost stories. But then I saw it myself 5 years ago, and I knew it was real. Jake's mind was racing, trying to process everything. So what does it want? Why is it following me if I didn't do anything wrong? Ray shook his head. I don't know for sure, but I have a theory. I think the follower isn't just haunting the road. It's looking for something. Maybe it's looking for justice, for someone to finally tell the truth about what happened to David Holloway. Maybe it's looking for David's body so he can finally rest. Or maybe, and this is what scares me the most, it's looking for someone connected to Frank Morrison who's willing to finish what Frank couldn't bring himself to do, to make things right. Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Frank gave me this before he died. Its coordinates, the exact location where he buried David's body. He made me promise that someday, when the time was right, I would make sure David got a proper burial and his family got closure. I've been too afraid to do it myself, scared of what might happen if I go digging around out there, but maybe that's why the follower chose you, Jake. Maybe you're supposed to be the one who finally puts David Holloway to rest. Make sure you're subscribed to the Long Road Stories and hit that like button. Drop a comment with your location, because this story is about to take a turn that will change everything. Part 4 reveals what Jake decides to do with this impossible choice. Jake stared at the yellowed paper in Ray's weathered hands, feeling the weight of 40 years of secrets pressing down on him. The coordinates meant nothing to him without context, but the implications were staggering. His Uncle Frank, a man he had always admired, had killed someone and hidden the body in the Arizona desert. And now, somehow, Jake was being pulled into a supernatural debt that demanded payment. He took the paper slowly, unfolding it to reveal numbers written in faded ink, along with a crude, hand-drawn map showing landmarks near mile marker 247. If I do this, if I go out there and try to find the body, what happens then? Does the shadow stop following me? Or does something worse happen? Ray leaned back in the booth, his face drawn with exhaustion. I honestly don't know, but I can tell you what happened to the other drivers who saw the follower and ignored it. Most of them quit trucking within a year, couldn't handle the constant fear every time they had to drive at night. A few of them had accidents, nothing they could explain, just lost control of their rigs for no mechanical reason. One driver I knew, Tommy Chen, he saw the follower 7 times in 3 months. The last time, he swore the shadow got inside his cab with him. They found his truck stopped in the middle of the highway, engine running, but Tommy was catatonic in the driver's seat. He hasn't spoken a coherent word in 8 years. They keep him in a facility in Tucson, and when you look in his eyes, there's nothing there but terror. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. So my options are to either go digging around in the desert for a 40-year-old body or risk ending up like Tommy Chen. Ray nodded grimly. Or you could stop driving this route entirely, quit trucking if you have to, try to outrun whatever connection the follower has made with you. But I don't think that will work. I think once it's chosen you, it will find you wherever you go. The road has a way of calling truckers back, no matter how far they try to run. Jake looked down at the paper again. his mind spinning through impossible scenarios. If I find the body, how do I even report it without getting arrested? How do I explain that I knew where to look? Ray had clearly thought about this. There's a detective in Flagstaff, Marcus Rivera, who was a rookie cop when David Holloway disappeared. He never believed Frank's story, always suspected something more happened that night, but he could never prove anything. He's retired now, but he still thinks about the case. I have his number. If you find something, you call him directly. Tell him you were out hiking and stumbled across some remains. Don't mention Frank. Don't mention the coordinates. Let the authorities handle it from there. David's family deserves to know what happened to him, to give him a proper burial. Jake rubbed his face with both hands, trying to shake off the surreal feeling that had settled over him. This is insane. 24 hours ago, I was just a trucker doing my job, and now I'm being haunted by a shadow and expected to solve a 40-year-old mystery. Ray's expression softened slightly. I know how it sounds, trust me. When Frank first told me the truth, I thought he had lost his mind, but then I saw the follower myself, and I knew. There are things on these highways that can't be explained by logic or science. The road sees everything, remembers everything, and sometimes it demands payment for the sins committed on its surface. He pulled out a business card with a phone number written on it. This is Marcus Rivera's cell, and this is my number on the back. Whatever you decide to do, you don't have to do it alone. There are a few of us old-timers who know the truth about that stretch of Route 66. We'll help however we can. Jake pocketed both pieces of paper, his decision still unmade, but his curiosity overpowering his fear. Tell me more about David Holloway. Who was he really? If I'm going to do this, I need to understand what I'm getting into. Ray pulled out his phone and scrolled through some photos until he found what he was looking for. It was an old newspaper article from 1986, the headline reading, "Local trucker missing, foul play suspected." Below the headline was a photo of a man with dark hair and a friendly smile, standing next to his rig with his arm around a woman and two young children. David started driving trucks when he was 25. By all accounts, he was a good driver, reliable, friendly, but in '85 his wife got cancer. The medical bills piled up fast, and his insurance wasn't covering everything. He got desperate. Ray zoomed in on the image, his finger tracing the faces of David's children. His daughter Emily would be in her early 40s now, and his son Marcus would be about 40. After David disappeared, the family lost everything. The house, the savings, everything went to medical bills. David's wife died 6 months after he vanished, never knowing what happened to her husband. The kids grew up in foster care, separated from each other. Emily eventually became a nurse in Albuquerque, and Marcus, ironically, became a truck driver himself, probably trying to feel connected to the father he barely remembers. The weight of David's story settled heavily on Jake's shoulders. This wasn't just about a shadow or a supernatural haunting. It was about real people whose lives had been destroyed by a series of tragic choices and terrible circumstances. "How do you know so much about them?" Jake asked. Ray looked uncomfortable. "After Frank told me what happened, I couldn't stop thinking about David's family. I did some research, found out where the kids ended up. I even sent them anonymous money orders a few times over the years, trying to help in some small way without revealing what I knew. I guess I thought if I couldn't bring David back, at least I could try to ease some of the suffering his disappearance caused. But money doesn't bring closure, Jake. Those kids grew up thinking their father abandoned them, that he chose crime over his family. They deserve to know the truth, that David died trying to save his wife, even if his methods were illegal." Jake stood up from the booth, suddenly needing to move, to think. He walked to the diner's window and looked out at the parking lot, at the rows of trucks sitting silent in the darkness. Each one represented a driver with their own stories, their own secrets, their own connections to the endless miles of American highways. When Frank died, did the shadow appear to him one last time? Ray joined Jake at the window. He had a massive heart attack while driving through that same stretch of Route 66. His truck veered off the road near mile marker 253. Witnesses who stopped to help said Frank was already gone, but his eyes were wide open, staring at something in his rearview mirror. The mirror itself was shattered, like he had punched it or like something had hit it from the inside. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, but I always wondered if the follower finally came for him, if it reached through that mirror and stopped his heart. Jake shuddered at the image. "And you think if I find David's body and report it, this all ends? The hauntings stop, the shadow disappears, everyone gets closure?" Ray turned to face him directly. "I think it's the only chance any of us have. The follower appeared to you for a reason, Jake. Maybe because you're Frank's nephew, maybe because you're one of the few people who could actually make things right without facing legal consequences. Frank's dead, so he can't be prosecuted. You didn't commit any crime, so you have nothing to lose by reporting what you find. It's as close to perfect as this situation could get." Jake looked at the coordinates in his hand, then back at Ray. "How far into the desert did Frank take the body? Is it even possible to find after 40 years? Ray pulled up a satellite map on his phone and entered the coordinates. "According to these numbers, it's about half a mile off the highway in a small canyon between two rock formations." Frank described it as a place where the desert meets scattered Joshua trees and old mining equipment. The area hasn't been developed, no hiking trails nearby, no reason for anyone to stumble across it by accident. If the body is still there, it's been waiting undisturbed for 4 decades. Jake made his decision in that moment, perhaps driven by the same sense of responsibility that had haunted his uncle, or perhaps driven by the need to stop seeing that shadow in his mirror. "I'll do it. Tomorrow morning, I'll drive back to mile marker 247 and find that canyon, but I want you to come with me. If something goes wrong, I need someone who knows the full story." Ray looked surprised, then slowly nodded. "All right, we'll take my truck, park off the highway where it's less visible. We'll need shovels, water, GPS, and probably some courage. But Jake, you need to understand something. Once we start digging around out there, there's no going back. Whatever happens, whatever we find or don't find, it's going to change things. The desert protects its secrets fiercely, and we're about to violate one of the biggest secrets it's been keeping." Jake extended his hand. "Then we'd better get started before I change my mind." They shook hands, sealing an agreement that would take them into the heart of a mystery that had been waiting since the administration of Ronald Reagan for someone brave enough or foolish enough to finally uncover it. Keep watching, subscribe to the Long Road Stories, hit that like button, and comment with your location. Part 5 takes us into the desert where the truth has been buried for 40 years, and where the follower has been waiting. The Arizona sun was merciless as Jake and Ray stood at mile marker 247 the next morning, their trucks parked on a dirt access road that led away from the highway. They had equipped themselves with hiking packs, shovels, water bottles, a portable GPS unit, and Ray's detailed notes from Frank's confession. The desert stretched before them in endless waves of red rock and sparse vegetation, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Jake had barely slept after their conversation at the truck stop, his mind replaying everything Ray had told him about David Holloway, Frank Morrison, and the shadow that connected them all across 4 decades. Ray checked the GPS coordinates one more time, then pointed toward a formation of rust-colored rocks about half a mile distant. "According to Frank's map, we need to head toward those formations. There should be a small canyon between them, and somewhere in that canyon is where he buried David." Frank said he marked the spot with 3 white rocks arranged in a triangle, but after 40 years, who knows if they're still there or if the desert has reclaimed them. They began walking, their boots crunching on the hard, packed sand. The morning air was cool, but Jake could already feel the heat building as the sun climbed higher. Around them, the desert was alive with subtle sounds, the rustle of lizards darting between rocks, the distant cry of a hawk, the whisper of wind through the sparse Joshua trees. As they walked, Ray told Jake more details about the night David Holloway died. Frank said David wasn't a bad person, just a desperate one. When Frank looked in that trailer and saw what David was involved with, it wasn't just stolen electronics. There were documents, paperwork that showed David was part of a much larger operation that stretched across multiple states. The people running it were dangerous, connected to organized crime. Frank understood in that moment why David was so nervous, so eager to get Frank to leave. David knew that if Frank reported what he had seen, David's partners would assume he had talked, and they would kill him, and probably his family too. Jake adjusted his backpack, feeling the weight of the shovels. So Frank was protecting David by keeping quiet? Ray shook his head. Frank was protecting himself. He knew that if he reported the theft ring and David disappeared anyway, those same dangerous people might come after him as a witness. When the fight happened and David died, Frank saw it as a way to make the whole problem disappear. No David meant no witness to what Frank had seen, no trail leading back to him. But Frank didn't count on the guilt, didn't realize that keeping a secret like that would eat him alive from the inside. They reached the rock formation after 25 minutes of steady walking. Between the two massive outcroppings, just as Frank had described, was a narrow canyon that cut into the earth like a scar. The canyon was maybe 30 feet wide and descended gradually into shadow. Ancient petroglyphs marked some of the rock walls, symbols left by indigenous peoples centuries ago, silent witnesses to countless human dramas played out in this unforgiving landscape. "This is it," Ray said quietly, his voice carrying a note of reverence or fear. Jake couldn't tell which. They descended into the canyon, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of 3 white rocks arranged in a triangle. The canyon floor was littered with stones of various sizes, displaced by decades of flash floods and erosion. Small scrub bushes clung to life in scattered patches, and the air smelled of dust and something ancient. They had been searching for nearly an hour when Jake found them. 3 white rocks, partially buried in sand but still visible, arranged in a triangle just as Frank had described. The rocks were about 10 feet apart, forming a triangle approximately 12 feet on each side. In the center of that triangle, the ground looked slightly depressed, as if the earth had settled over time. Jake called Ray over, and they stood together looking down at what was likely David Holloway's final resting place. "This is it," Jake said, his mouth dry, despite the water he had been drinking. "After all these years, here it is." Ray pulled out his phone and took several photographs, documenting the location, the white rocks, the surrounding terrain. "Before we start digging, we need to mark this spot precisely on GPS. When we call Detective Rivera, we need to be able to lead him right back here." After recording the exact coordinates, they began the grim task of excavating the site. The desert soil was hard-packed and mixed with rocks, making the digging slow and exhausting. They took turns, one digging while the other kept watch and drank water. An hour passed, then 2. The sun reached its zenith, beating down on them with brutal intensity. Jake's shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were blistered despite his work gloves. Then, at a depth of about 3 feet, Jake's shovel struck something that wasn't rock or hard-packed earth. He stopped, his heart suddenly pounding. "Ray, I found something!" Ray immediately joined him in the hole they had dug, and together they carefully cleared away more soil. What emerged made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Fabric, faded and partially deteriorated, but unmistakably the denim of jeans. They dug more carefully now, using their hands as much as their shovels, and gradually they uncovered what was clearly human remains. A skeleton, still partially clothed in the tatters of jeans and what had once been a flannel shirt. Near what would have been the waist, they found a belt buckle, tarnished but still intact, with the initials D.H. engraved on it. "David Holloway," Ray whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "After 40 years, we finally found him." Jake sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the reality of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just a skeleton or evidence in a cold case. This was a father, a husband, a man who had made desperate choices trying to save someone he loved. This was someone's son, someone's friend, someone who had been missing for 4 decades, while his children grew up wondering what had happened to him. "We need to call Detective Rivera now," Jake said, pulling out his phone. But before he could dial, something made him look up toward the rim of the canyon. Standing there, silhouetted against the bright Arizona sky, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, with arms that hung down past where knees should be. The follower, even in broad daylight, even under the harsh desert sun, it was there, watching them. Jake felt his blood turn to ice. "Ray," he said quietly, pointing toward the rim. Ray looked up and saw it too. For a long moment neither of them moved, and the shadow didn't move either. It simply stood there, a dark presence that seemed to absorb the light around it, rather than cast its own shadow. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one of those impossibly long arms and pointed down into the canyon, directly at the remains of David Holloway. "It knows," Ray said, his voice barely audible. "It knows we found him." As they watched, the shadow began to change. It seemed to shimmer and waver, like heat rising from pavement, and for just a moment Jake could swear he saw the outline of a man within that darkness, a man wearing trucker's clothes, a man with a face that matched the photograph from the newspaper article, David Holloway. Then the shadow turned and began walking away from the canyon rim, moving back toward the highway. But unlike before, it didn't glide or float. It walked like a man, with a gait that suggested relief, or perhaps release. Jake and Ray scrambled out of the canyon and ran after the figure, their exhaustion forgotten in their urgent need to understand what they had just witnessed. They reached the canyon rim just in time to see the shadow reach the highway where their trucks were parked. It stood there for a moment at exactly mile marker 247, the precise spot where David Holloway had last been seen alive in October of 1986. Then, as they watched from 200 yards away, the shadow began to fade. It didn't vanish instantly like it had in Jake's rearview mirror. Instead, it dissolved gradually, like morning mist burning away under the sun, until there was nothing left but empty highway and desert wind. Make sure you're subscribed to the Long Road Stories and leave a like. Drop a comment with your location. Part 6 will reveal what happened after the discovery and whether the followers' release brought peace or something else entirely. Detective Marcus Rivera arrived at the canyon 3 hours after Jake's call, accompanied by forensic techs and county officials. Rivera was in his mid-60s now, with grey hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with the darker aspects of human nature. When Jake and Ray led him to the site, his expression was unreadable, but Jake noticed his hands trembling slightly as he looked down at the remains they had uncovered. "After 39 years on the force and 7 years of retirement, I never thought I would see this day," Rivera said quietly. "David Holloway. I knew something had happened to him out here. I just couldn't prove it." The forensic team set to work documenting the scene, photographing every angle, carefully excavating the remains with the kind of precision that Jake and Ray's desperate digging had lacked. Rivera pulled Jake aside, away from the activity. "You said you were out hiking and just happened to find this location, in the middle of the desert, half a mile from the nearest marked trail, in a canyon that hasn't seen human foot traffic in decades." Jake met his eyes, knowing that his story sounded implausible, but having no better explanation that wouldn't implicate his dead uncle in a 40-year-old homicide. "Sometimes people just get lucky, Detective, or maybe unlucky, depending on how you look at it. We saw the white rocks from a distance, got curious, and found this. That's the truth." Rivera studied Jake for a long moment, then glanced over at Ray, who was standing near their parked trucks, looking exhausted and emotionally drained. "You know what I think? I think someone who knew what happened to David Holloway 40 years ago decided it was finally time for the truth to come out. I think that someone guided you here, directly to this spot, because they couldn't live with the secret anymore. And I think that someone is already dead, so there's no point in me pursuing it further." He handed Jake his business card. "If you remember any other details about how you found this location, or if anyone contacts you with more information, you call me directly. But between you and me, I'm just grateful David's kids will finally get some closure. That's what matters most at this point." The forensic examination took most of the afternoon. The medical examiner confirmed that the remains were consistent with a male in his mid-30s who had died approximately 40 years ago. The belt buckle with the initials, combined with dental records that Rivera had kept in David Holloway's cold case file, would provide definitive identification within a few days. More importantly, they found evidence of trauma to the skull, consistent with a fall or a blow to the head. Rivera told Jake that the death would likely be ruled accidental or possibly self-defense, given the circumstances and the age of the case. "There's no one alive to prosecute even if we wanted to," Rivera said. "Frank Morrison is dead. David's partners in the theft ring either died or went to prison for other crimes years ago. This case is about giving David a proper burial and telling his family what happened, nothing more." As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake and Ray stood by their trucks, watching the official vehicles finally depart with David's remains. The canyon was quiet again, returned to the desert that had held its secret for so long. "Do you think it's really over?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse from the long day. Ray looked out toward mile marker 247, visible in the distance. "I think David Holloway can finally rest. Whether the follower was his spirit or some kind of manifestation of unfinished business, I believe we did what needed to be done. The road witnessed a crime, and the road demanded justice. We gave it what it wanted." Jake pulled out his phone and looked at the dozens of messages from his dispatcher, wondering how he would explain being out of contact for an entire day. Then he saw a news alert that made his heart skip. "Missing truckers' remains found after 4 decades" was already breaking on local Arizona news stations. The story would spread quickly, and within days, David Holloway's children would learn what had happened to their father. Jake thought about Emily, the nurse in Albuquerque, and Marcus, the truck driver who had followed in his father's footsteps without knowing the full story. They would finally have answers, finally be able to mourn properly, finally know that their father hadn't abandoned them but had died in circumstances beyond his control. 2 weeks later, Jake found himself attending David Holloway's funeral in Amarillo, Texas. He hadn't planned to go, but something compelled him to be there, to witness the end of a story that had pulled him into its orbit so unexpectedly. The service was small but dignified, held at a cemetery under vast Texas skies. Emily and Marcus Holloway stood together at the graveside, their faces showing the complex emotions of grief mixed with relief. Emily gave a brief eulogy, speaking about the father she barely remembered but never stopped missing, about the questions that had haunted her family for 4 decades, and about the strange blessing of finally having answers, even if those answers came so late. After the service, Marcus approached Jake, having learned from Detective Rivera that Jake was the one who had found their father's remains. "I don't know how you ended up in that exact spot in the middle of the desert," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "But my sister and I want to thank you. Not knowing was worse than anything. We always wondered if our dad had left us intentionally, if we had done something wrong, if he had just decided his family wasn't worth staying for. Now we know he was trying to help our mum, that he died in an accident, that he never wanted to leave us. That knowledge, as painful as it is, brings a kind of peace we've never had." Jake shook his hand, unable to find adequate words, simply nodding in understanding. That night, Jake drove his Kenworth back toward Arizona, his load of freight feeling lighter somehow despite its physical weight. As he approached mile marker 247 on Route 66, he tensed, half expecting to see the shadow appear in his rearview mirror one final time. But the road behind him remained empty, illuminated only by his trailer lights and the silver glow of a crescent moon. He drove through that 17-mile stretch without incident, and for the first time since this had all begun, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The follower was gone. David Holloway was at rest. The desert had released its secret, and the road had released its grip. But mysteries on America's highways never truly end. They simply transform into new stories waiting to be discovered. 3 months after David Holloway's burial, Jake was driving through New Mexico when his CB radio crackled to life with a familiar voice. "Shadowhawk, This is Desert Fox. You got your ears on? Jake grabbed the microphone, surprised and pleased to hear from Ray again. Desert Fox, this is Shadowhawk. I read you loud and clear. How have you been? There was a pause. Then Ray's voice came back, but it sounded uncertain, almost frightened. Jake, I need to talk to you about something. I've been driving through Montana, up near the Canadian border, and I've started seeing something in my mirrors. It's not the same as the follower, but it's similar, and I'm not the only one. Other drivers have been reporting strange things on Highway 2, always at night, always in the same stretch. I think there's another story waiting to be told, another secret the road is trying to reveal. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, not of fear exactly, but of recognition. He understood now that he had been chosen not just to resolve David Holloway's story, but to become part of something larger, a network of truckers who witnessed the unexplained and unnatural things that existed in the margins of America's endless highways. Give me the coordinates, Ray. If there's another story out there, another mystery that needs solving, I guess I'm the guy who's supposed to find it. As Ray relayed the information, Jake looked out at the road stretching before him, a ribbon of asphalt that connected cities and states and lives in ways that most people would never understand. The highway holds secrets, some buried in desert sand, others hidden in mountain passes or lost in endless plains. For those who spend their lives on these roads, the line between the natural and supernatural becomes blurred, and sometimes the only way forward is to embrace the mystery rather than run from it. Jake Morrison had learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, but he had also discovered a purpose he never knew he needed. The road had chosen him to be its voice, to uncover its secrets and tell its stories. And somewhere out there, on a dark stretch of highway under vast American skies, another shadow was waiting for someone brave enough to follow it toward the truth. What Jake didn't know yet, what he would only discover when he reached that Montana highway Ray had mentioned, was that some stories don't end with closure or peace. Some stories open doors to even deeper mysteries, connecting the living and the dead in ways that defy explanation. The follower might have found its rest, but there were countless other entities and enigmas wandering America's roads, each with their own tale to tell, each waiting for the right person to finally see them and understand. And Jake Morrison, the trucker who had inherited his uncle's guilt and transformed it into resolution, was about to become the chronicler of these impossible stories, 1 mile marker at a time. Seen something you can't explain on the highway? Tell me your mile. More true stories from America's dark roads, every week here on the Long Road Stories.